Good evening all, and welcome. We haven't had an exclusive video on haunted hospitals in quite a while, so it's time to get ready. Grab your flashlight, follow me on Twitter, and let the darkness take control. I work as a teletech while I'm in school, and when the unit secretary leaves for lunch, I will cover the desk for the time being, since it's right outside the tele room. I was sorting the heart rhythm strips and someone walks up to the desk and said he was looking for the exit. I pointed in the direction right as I looked up to acknowledge him standing there and saw he was in a gown with a wristband. So I asked him his room number and to wait while I called his PCA to walk with him downstairs. I called the PCA and gave her the room number. She told me, "That can't be the right room. The patient died about 20 minutes ago. Was it his family?" I told her he had a wristband on, or maybe I had heard or was given the wrong room number. She came to the desk to cover the monitors for me, and I went to peek in the room he told me to see if it was the wrong room and find out which room he was in. Sure enough, laying dead in the bed was the same guy who walked up to the desk no longer than 10 minutes before I went in there. We had a patient who informed me that her deceased husband was in there with us, literally there in the room, to take her home. I tried to gently tell her that there was nobody in there with us, but she insisted that her husband was there, and that he'd be taking her home that afternoon after the kids' visit. Okay, fine, whatever. I brushed it off as dementia talk and figured that if she's happy in this delusion, I'm happy. But sure enough, her kids and grandkids come to visit, left, and she died very peacefully. Gives me shivers to this day. We also have a haunted room. We're only 6 beds, 3 on the left, 3 on the right, with a nurse's station right in the middle. I was at the station chatting with the nurses. This was very early on working there, so I was probably asking some kind of stupid question. Out of the corner of my left eye, I see this elderly gentleman walk into the last room. I took off running because no one should be ambulating without assistance. Only once I get to their room, it was empty, and only then did I realize we didn't have any patients in that room to begin with. I walked back to the nurse's station to find everyone smiling and said, "Did anyone else see a patient out of bed?" One of our nurses just chuckled and said, "Honey, you just met the spook." I've never seen him since, but everyone said it's a superstition around the hospice, and that he only shows himself to people that he likes, and it meant I was formally a part of the team now. I work on an adult oncology unit where unfortunately we have a lot of comfort care patients. The majority of them transition to hospice, where they live out their final days. Sometimes they don't quite make it, and they pass away while they're still in the hospital. We have the most deaths in the hospital on our unit, and a lot of floats don't like coming up to the floor because everyone dies. We all love it though, and wouldn't have it any other way. There's so much love between all the nurses and our patients, and we get to know them really well. When people pass away, we have noticed that, not surprisingly, it comes in threes. We will go a few weeks with no one passing away. Everyone successfully makes it out of there and onto a hospice or to a TCU, wherever they choose to go to pass on. Only to have a week or two where we have 3 to 6 deaths a week. One week we had 2 patients pass away in one night. One of the patients was still room 8. She was really near and dear to our hearts, and it was a rough time for everyone involved. She had been on the floor for a prolonged period of time as we all watched her go from a spry old lady to basically wasting away in all aspects. She passed at night, and by the next day there was a new patient in her room. It's hard on us all, and we all know patients come and go, and we have to move on. I was doing the admission with the new patient and going over room orientation stuff. I explained that she has a one-stop shop remote which controlled the lights, TV, radio, and had the call light. Right as I finished explaining to her that the TV buttons are right here, I set the remote down on her bed and instantly the TV turned on by itself. It began flipping through each channel at an alarming rate, faster than if you were just to hold down the channel up button. She was a little older and thankfully was not observant and thought I was doing it, but no one was touching it. She says, "No thank you, I don't want the TV on right now." So I reached down and tried to turn it off. It didn't turn off, and I ended up panicking a bit inside and yanked the remote out of the wall and telling her that it seemed not to be working properly and that I would get her a new one. The TV still wouldn't turn off after I unplugged the remote from the wall, and normally it would be all connected and not working if it wasn't plugged in properly. I had to end up walk and manually shut off the TV. I head out of there telling her I'd be right back, and as I went to the nurse's desk to grab another one, I ran into another nurse. She was grabbing another remote, which was odd. We just got a new shipment in, and they were all normally working properly. We rarely had to replace them anymore, and I asked her if her remote was broken too, and she said that hers was acting up. I then asked her which room she was in, and it was another room that a patient had passed in the night before also. The TV remotes were uncharacteristically acting up from across the wing at the same time in the same rooms that people had died the night before. Freaky. I could ramble forever, but most stories are related to the TV. I had another situation similar to the one I just described, where the volume was going up and down by itself in a room where a patient had passed on recently. I've seen lights not work and then work again. I have even seen a sink turn on where there was no one else around. We have several designated rooms that are reserved for our comfort care patients, and even when they are occupied, we will walk by them and it feels like someone's in there. But when we look, it's clearly empty. We have a room where IV pumps stop working and BP machines quit on us, and nothing seems to work. But that room got cleansed by a healing touch volunteer, which I know sounds crazy, but since then everything in the room works fine. I've never been a huge believer in the paranormal or supernatural, but after working on this unit the past year, it's not hard to believe. We all just embrace it, because what can you really do? I'm a nurse, and was walking down the hallway and going into the clean utility room to get a warm blanket. Someone was walking ahead of me about 6 to 8 feet. I couldn't tell you anything about them or what they looked like, but I remember thinking it was a staff member. They opened the door to the clean utility, which requires a punching code, and it shuts before I got to it. Mildly annoyed that they didn't hold it open for me, I opened the door, but no one's in there. I thought it was weird but didn't tell anyone about it or think much of it. Or later that night, a co-worker and I were talking about the shift and she said, "Oh yeah, and now we have a ghost." I asked her what she meant, and she went on to explain my exact experience, only it had been told to her by another co-worker. Same hallway, same clean utility, the same general feeling of it being a staff member, but he couldn't tell you any descriptive details at all. It has since happened to 3 more people over the last year or so. The lady in 606 hated the TV on in her room. She lived there for years and would yell at roomies that turned their TV on. She would also fall asleep holding the button on her call bell to just annoy us. One day she dies in the middle of the night while I'm not there, and the nurse on duty at the other station reported the automatic front doors opening for no reason. It was later discovered that this was moments after her death. There is a low census, so her room remains empty. Nursing assistants would frequently go into 606 and watch TV on their breaks, They reported that the TV would frequently turn off for no reason as they watched it. Her call bell would go off without anyone being in the room for months after her death. This was an old building with faulty wiring, but nonetheless, it was still very creepy. I'm a nurse. My orientation tonight included all the spooky stories. There were 2 travel nurses that worked in L&D that decided to drive out of town to Vegas or Austin. Unfortunately, they had a really bad accident and one of them died. The night she died, there was a loud scream heard through the hospital. It was so loud that the nurses checked room by room in multiple units to see where it came from. A day or 2 later, everyone found out about the death. The time of the accident was the same time that everyone heard the scream. Another story was our PEDS floor. We overflow there when P&P and L&D is full. Every department has the isolation room, which has the anteroom separated by the solid door and then a door with a window. A patient reported to her nurse that there was a young girl who kept staring at them through the door window. She even entered and went to the bathroom to sit in the tub. Finally, the last story. Doing stairs is a good way to get some exercise and keep you awake. We have 7 floors, so not too bad. Unfortunately, sometimes you just get the bad feeling when using the stairs in the middle of the night. Sometimes it feels like someone is in the stairs with you. You could even occasionally hear noises. So stairs are avoided now at night. In that same vein, sometimes the elevator will stop on our floor and open if someone pressed the button, but there's no one inside, and no one pressed the button. I work in long-term care, and we have tons of stories. I'll give you 2 of my favorite ones. We had a woman in our assisted living unit. She was a very sweet lady with dementia who could never understand how to use her call light for assistance. So every night, she would meander over to her neighbor's apartment and ask him to get someone to help her get ready for bed. He would then put on his call light and tell whomever came that the lady needed help. The man is still with us, and he has no cognitive deficits or memory problems. He's here because of severe kidney issues and can't manage all of his tubes and medication. The lady became ill with pancreas issues and stopped knocking on the man's door for about a month. She sadly passed away one evening at 4 p.m. And at approximately 7 that night, while the family was still in the lady's room with her, the man put on his call light and said that the lady was ready for bed. Creepy, right? The CNA figured he was just picking up an old routine, so she asked him, "She came here?" He went on to explain that she must have snuck in the door because he didn't hear her knock. She was wearing a white robe and holding her rosary beads. The CNA told me all of this, and I, being a huge skeptic, didn't believe it. He must have been dreaming. The family finally left, and when the funeral home director arrived to take the body, I went out with him to help move her onto the cart. We walk into the room, and there she was laying in bed, white gown, rosary beads in hand. The neighbor still occasionally puts on his light for her. The second story. The building I work in sits on the same site as the old nursing home in town. It was bought out by a non-profit, torn down, and rebuilt into the building I work in now. The old building had a very friendly lady that worked in the kitchen as a cook. She worked there until she retired, and a few years later she had a stroke and came to live in the new building. She had vascular dementia pretty badly and would find her way into the kitchen all the time. We had to guide her back to her room. She died about a year ago. Ever since she passed, strange things would happen in this kitchen. You can hear fridge doors open and slam closed. You can hear water running and things falling. I've watched the light turn on and off, and there were always cold spots in the kitchen, in different spots every night. One night took the cake though. A CNA was in the kitchen getting chips to stock when she said the walk-in freezer door came open and she watched a dark, smoke-like outline walk out, stop, turn to her, wave, and disappear. She didn't go back into the kitchen after that. I offered her $100 once, and she point blank refused. Bonus story. My wife was pregnant, and we had our C-section scheduled early because she has polyhydramnios, and our son was measuring 11 pounds at 36 weeks. Holy huge alien baby. He was only born 10 pounds though. The hospital we decided on was only 2 blocks away from our house, but very old and very institutional looking. The OB unit was one very long hallway with rooms on either side and a nurse's station in the middle. Our son was born and we spent the next 3 days in the unit. Where we came up to the unit, we noticed another couple was in one of the birthing suites at the opposite end of the hallway from us. We heard that babies crying every day at completely appropriate intervals for the duration of our stay. It would cry for 3 to 4 minutes every 1 to 2 hours like clockwork. When we were being discharged home, we asked the nurse if the other couple on the unit had a boy or girl. The nurse gave us a puzzled look and told us that we were the only couple on the unit. The other couple was discharged before our son was born. We're going to another hospital if we have another child. Okay, another bonus. My wife has had 2 miscarriages since our son was born. This last Christmas Day we took our son to the site of the cemetery where the unborn babies are buried. It had just snowed the night before, so the whole ground was covered with fresh snow. We couldn't even drive into the cemetery yet because it hadn't been plowed, so we parked on the road. This is a very rural cemetery with maybe 100 plots. When we walked into the cemetery, there was a single set of very small footprints, a child's for sure, that led through the gate and weaved through the gravestones directly to the spot where our babies were buried and stopped. The prints did not turn around or go back or lead anywhere else in the cemetery. They simply walked to that burial spot and stopped. The second we got to the spot that our babies are buried at, it started to snow the biggest, most beautiful snowflakes I've ever seen. We said a little prayer, my wife cried a little, and we walked back to the truck. It stopped snowing again by the time we got back to the truck. Crazy. So I had this patient, mid-30s, female, perfectly healthy. We get chatting and I learn a little bit about her. She had just moved in with her fiancé. According to this fiancé, their new house was 100% movie haunted. Stuff being moved and missing, doors slamming shut, strange sounds at night, the works. He came home one day from work and found her crying in front of the bathroom mirror. He asked her why she was so upset, and she said she couldn't remember, just that she felt tired and wanted to go to bed. When she woke up, she said she couldn't breathe, so he took her to the ER. One emergency surgery, an ICU stay later, I transfer her to telemetry. Well, when we transferred her to the floor, the first thing she did was ask them to cover up the mirror. The way their rooms are set up is that the bed is on one end, and at the opposite end of the bed is the dresser/sink/mirror. If you sat up straight in bed, you could see yourself in the mirror, and it makes a lot of patients uncomfortable and is not that uncommon of a request. So we happily taped a bedsheet up and left. The story goes that one morning, the tech bathed her and got her up into the chair. They do baths very early in the morning, so the patient must have fallen asleep in the recliner. The tech left to get extra sheets to cover the mirror, but got distracted and forgot all about leaving the woman in the room alone with the uncovered mirror. Well, the call bell goes off a little while later, and after realizing her slip, the tech goes to grab a sheet. When she entered the room, she found to her horror that the woman was dead on the floor with her test tube ripped out. I'm not one that believes in ghosts, but some of these stories I've heard about haunted rooms and units come from reliable sources, and once from my own. When I was a nurse assistant, we had 73 on the ortho floor that was haunted by a small child. On numerous occasions, patients in this room would hit the call light and ask us to get these kids out my room. One night a patient called out and asked me to shut his door because there were kids laughing in the hallway. It was the middle of the night and no kids were on the floor. I just apologized and shut the door. 10 minutes later, he calls and asks us to get the little girl in his room out because she was at the foot of his bed. I went in there and he said that she was gone, but that she'd been staring at him. These things happened several times over my 3 years working there. The second story I never actually witnessed, but has actual interactions with ghosts and spirits/patients. I was working at the hospital in the south that has 2 ICUs. The one on the 3rd floor was basically an overflow where the main unit got full but had 8 beds in it. Supposedly a nurse that had worked in the hospital a long time ago had died in room 2. Kind of a catty corner, the desk and difficult to actually see in while sitting at the desk. One night a nurse was chatting and out of the corner of her eye, she saw another nurse walk into that room. She got curious after a few minutes because the room was empty and she assumed someone went in there and got cords or something. She gets up and goes in, but there's no one in the room. In the same room, a nurse went in early in the morning to do some dressing changes on a patient. The patient was AO times 4 and completely with it, but was confused as to why the nurse was doing dressing changes. The patient stated, "There was another nurse in here 10 minutes ago that changed my dressing." Thinking it was the other nurse in the unit that night as there were only 2, she went ahead and thanked the other nurse. The other nurse said she hadn't changed any dressings and had been doing something with her patient for several minutes. Other smaller stories happened, but they always took place in room 2 when there were only 2 nurses working that unit. I work night shift on a medical/oncology unit where it's not uncommon to have hospice patients. Back when I was working as a CNA, I used to hang out at the back nurses' station near the oncology rooms and study for the NCLEX on slow nights. One extremely slow night, when the oncology rooms were all empty, I heard a clicking sound while I was reading. When patients are using a walker incorrectly, it makes a distinct sound against the tile, and the cadence matches that of someone walking. I look up to see which of the medical patients was awake and walking around, only to see no one there. I get up to investigate. I approach the first 2 rooms, and the clicking sound is definitely not coming from there. As I approach the doorway of the 3rd room, the clicking sound gets closer, and when I get to the doorway, the clicking stops. I give up my search and return to studying. A few minutes later, the clicks resume, and I reapproach the door to the 3rd room and it stops again. I head back to my studies and the clicking resumes, and before I can even sit down, I decide to check the rest of the rooms, rather than trying the 3rd room again. The clicking continues. I'm reapproaching the 3rd room, the clicking stops. At this point I'm feeling a bit creeped out, and I'm just assuming my mind is playing tricks on me. I decide to head up to the front of the unit where the nurses are chatting, and think nothing more of it until a few nights later. A few nights after the event, my unit was having a particularly busy night. The other CNAs, as I was still prepping for the NCLX at the time, was pulled into a 1-to-1 about an hour into the shift, and all the nurses were maxed out at 7 patients. I was the only aide on the floor, and the nurses were trying to get their 9 PM med pass done, first and largest med pass of the shift. Needless to say, it was crazy. Of course, the family of a confused patient chooses then to leave for the night, causing abuela, or grandma, to sundown hard. Every 5 minutes she's setting off the bed alarm, and she's too unsteady to be up without assistance. She's too confused to use her walker, and she's trying to clean the house, so she's moving in ways that are making her more likely to fall. After a few hours of this and several calls to the doctor by the nurse, charge nurse, and house officer, the patient is put on 1-to-1. Both CNAs are now sitting with confused patients, and the nurses are maxed out. At this point it's about midnight. The nurses are either charting or working on their midnight med pass. The room I'm sitting in is close enough to the nurse's station that I can hear the call light system at any time the patient calls. While Abuela is continuing on with her confused behavior, I hear a bathroom alarm ring on the call light system. When a patient pushes the call button, the system beeps once about every 1 to 2 seconds. When the patient pulls the bathroom cord for assistance getting off the toilet, the system beeps 4 times a second. The majority of patient falls occur in the bathroom, hence the more annoying sound to direct priority. The bathroom alarm is continuing to ring and ring. Why the hell aren't the nurses answering the call light, I ask myself. Where the hell are they? The nurses are carrying portable phones, roughly the size of an old Nokia, just not as durable, which ring with the call lights. Are the phones not working? Sometimes it happens. What feels like 15 minutes later, the bathroom alarm is still ringing, and at this point I'm surprised there hasn't been a code 4 announced. Finally, the nurse comes into the room and I tell her that I'll go back. As long as I'm out the room, the nurses can't leave, so the patient can still be safe. As soon as I step out of the room, I realize that I'm not hearing the call light system. I'm hearing a telephone in one of the patient's rooms, loudly. It's not a ring like a pickup ring, but rather a non-stop ring. One that I've never heard these kind of phones do before nor since. The ring is coming from the opposite direction of the nurse's station. It's coming from down the hall in the oncology room. Not just any room, but the furthest room. I begin heading towards the sound, and as I get to the oncology rooms, they're all dark and absent of patients. As I approach the room in question, I can see the phone light up as it continues its drawn-out ring. As I step out the room, I feel a shiver go down my spine, and I physically shudder. I've never felt this feeling before. As I walk across the room, I feel someone staring at the back of my head. It feels as though someone is pouring out every ounce of hatred and rage into that stare. Words cannot do justice to explain the feelings directed at me. As I walk around the empty bed, I pick up my pace. I pick up the phone and slam it down and run out the room. As soon as I cross the threshold, I feel physically relieved. No hatred or rage being directed at me. I quickly walked back to Abuela's room and let the nurse finish her med pass. This unfortunately was not the last time I had to deal with this ghost. Occasionally when I have to go into that room to grab extra equipment or a chair, I can feel the angry presence. Luckily, the ghost is usually pretty dormant whenever there's a patient in the room. Not always, but usually. I've had a few patients complain about not being able to sleep or relax in that room in particular, or they would complain about nightmares. Once, and thankfully only once, the malevolence could even be felt during the day. On a few occasions I've sent co-workers into the room for various reasons and then asked them about it afterwards. Most of them have agreed that something doesn't feel quite right in there. The first hospital I worked at had a haunted room. It wasn't really a room, it was a larger, mini unit with 4 beds and monitors that we used as a higher acuity area. The code blue call light would go on and off when no one was in it, and biomedical had checked out several times but couldn't find anything wrong with the system, and even after replacing it completely it still happened. Equipment and people's personal items would go missing and turn up in there. Things would randomly fall over or move around. We had several patients who asked to be moved out of that room because no matter what the thermostat setting was, they complained it was freezing. But the scariest one happened to me. when I had a dementia patient in that room, and while I was rounding on her, she asked me to close the door because of that scary man who keeps watching me. To set the scene, our hospital has just opened up a brand new building that our ICU theatres, radiology, ED, and 3 wards moved into only 6 months ago. I work in ED, and as part of the move, we've opened up an ESSU, Emergency Short Stay Unit, a 6-bed unit that patients who were expecting to discharge in under 24 hours, but there's no point admitting under a surgical or medical team, can go and stay in a ward environment until they're good to go home. Oldies that have come to us at night, that live at home alone, low-risk chest pains waiting for a 6-hour trop test, stable patients awaiting transfer to a big hospital. That's the sort of stuff we're thinking of. I've just finished a run of night shifts, and each shift, the ESSU nurse has reported things out of the ordinary. The first 2 nights, it was the small, unmounted whiteboard for patients' names sliding off the desk and onto the floor. The next 2 nights, another registered nurse allocated there said that one of the cardiac monitors, which have all been on standby, has just woken up on its own. Turns out that in the 6 months that we had the ESSU, we've already had a patient die there. One of the other nurses remembers running a patient from the ESSU back into resus with a Gordled airway in, and passing away with no family members in sight. Cue X-Files theme. The last place I worked, like so many other wards here in Denmark, had a 6-hour room, where dead patients would stay for 6 hours before they checked again for signs of death, and moved to the morgue, still attached to the hospital as it's a rather big one. Not sure if this is a thing in other countries, but anyway, the patients are required to have a call line within reach in case they wake up, and are in fact not dead. So there are 5 to 6 call lines in the room. Anyway, it was an ER, and we had a fair amount of dead patients wait in that room over the years. Every now and then, and usually during a night shift, the call light would go on from that room, even without any patients there. You'd have to go down and then turn them off again, and sometimes they would go on again just as you left the room. Creepy as hell. I never liked going down there alone. It felt tense, thick. Technicians came and checked the connections and stuff, but everything worked without any problems. I used to work for a Catholic hospital before and after it was bought by a larger healthcare system. While I didn't witness any of these things myself, I do have 2 first-hand accounts of an incident involving a nun that committed suicide. Back before I was born, the nuns were very active at the hospital. They actually started the healthcare in our area, and the hospital continued to grow. Back in the 80s or early 90s, a nun decided to jump off the building and take her own life. Obviously, this caused quite an ordeal due to the Catholic Church. A family member of mine was employed at the hospital and had a window office. She was working in her office when she saw a large black flying thing fall past her window. It was the nun. Fast forward several years later, and a supervisor on night shift was making her rounds in the hospital. She entered a long hallway with only windows on one side. The hospital itself was probably 50 to 60 feet in length, with doors on either end, but no doors opposite the windows. As she was midway down the hallway, she felt something behind her and turned around. She witnessed a nun behind her, and thinking nothing of it, simply said, "Oh, hello," before continuing down the hallway. Suddenly she stopped, as the realization hit her. She realized the nun was floating. She instantly turned back around to an empty hallway. Hospital doors are very loud when you open them, and she didn't hear any doors opening, allowing anyone to leave the hallway. This hallway was just below where the nun had decided to end her life. When I first started working at the hospital, the charge nurse I made friends with on the oncology unit told me some ghost stories. One was about a little boy who died a long time ago from severe burns, when that was the pediatric ward. He said people started reporting seeing a little boy with bandages wrapped around his head, and they would die a day or two later. It sounds like a typical run-of-the-mill ghost story, until I was working on med-surg floor across the hospital one day. I had this patient whose condition was not improving, an old man with heart failure and arrhythmia. At one point during the day, I go in this man's room and he says, "Y'all need to do something about this little boy that keeps coming in here." Since I hadn't seen any kids running around, I asked him who he was talking about. He said the boy with all the bandages wrapped around his head. Needless to say, my heart sunk to my stomach, and I looked around the room, somewhat excited but scared as well, since I had never experienced anything like that. I asked him if he said anything to him, and he said that he sticks his head out the wall up there and smiles and asks if his pacemaker's working, and he pointed to the upper back corner of the room near the ceiling. Sorry to tell you guys that there was nothing there, but I can say 100% I was freaked out. He didn't see the boy again to my knowledge, but when I came back the next morning he had been transferred to the ICU overnight. And that is the only time in my life I have ever truly believed or come close to experiencing a ghost story. There was an abandoned hospital near my grandma's town. It was a tuberculosis hospital, and many people died there, but the bodies were never claimed, so they were buried in unmarked graves behind the hospital. From the people I have spoken to in the town, it was a miserable place to work. Some of the staff suffered from mental illness. One of the nurses ended her own life in the isolation ward in the 50s. Shortly after that, the hospital was shut down. It would be rented out to host gatherings and events, but quickly fell apart. People reported screaming, wheelchairs moving around and doors opening and closing, as well as strange odors coming from the building. When I was younger, I remember checking it out. We didn't go inside, but we heard wheels squeaking and screaming. Keep in mind the nearest houses were kilometers away, and it was up in the hills. We always got a creepy feeling when we passed by it, like we were being watched. Then one night in the mid-2010s, the hospital mysteriously caught fire. The gas lines and powers had been disconnected since the mid-70s, and an investigation revealed that it was not caused by arson. No one knows the true cause of the fire, but the belief is that it was the work of the souls trapped inside. I was taking care of an elderly patient, a very, very elderly patient. Actually, the oldest person I've ever taken care of. I don't remember why she was admitted, but it was minor, and she was due to go home the next day. She was A&O times 3, a very sharp lady, and she and I were having a nice little chat, and I was getting ready to wrap things up when she said, "I just want you to know who that little girl is standing behind you." The hair on the back of my neck rised up. I ran through a quick assessment again. She knew which hospital she was in, yet she was seeing invisible children in her room? What? I assure her there's no one else in the room. She was very nonplussed about it. I go out to the nurse's station and have the "my patient is hallucinating ghost children, please help me" conversation with my charge nurse, and she goes, "Oh, are they in room 26? Yeah? I figured. She's the third or fourth person who we've seen witness children in that room." I used to work night security as a patrolman in this old hospital. Our cubicle was set up outside the hospital as it was all fenced off. but it was fairly popular for people to try urban exploring within it. As you can imagine, our task was to ensure that people never got in the first place. We had a whole section of cameras in our little unit where we could see pretty much anyone coming in or out. There were some blind spots, and we were supposed to go out and walk the perimeter every hour, which we did. It would only be one of us, and of course night shift is when these people tend to come to do their exploring. The hospital itself didn't have much of interest left in it. It had been abandoned for so many years, but papers, desks, chairs, and the like still persisted within its walls. It was a damp, dusk, and humid place, pretty much one of the worst places you could possibly want to work. But fortunately for me, I only had to be in there about 10 minutes every hour. I had only been working there a few months at this point. Nothing remotely interesting had happened other than having to ferry out some teenagers who thought they'd try and smash a window. I caught them by chance walking my usual route, and instead of calling the cops, saw their terrified faces on their 15-year-old bodies and told them to just leave, and said that if they ever returned there'd be serious consequences. I never saw them again, not unless they broke in without me noticing. So as I'm doing my usual patrol, I have to go into the building. There are a couple of doors, but they're all locked, and the only one we tend to use is the main entrance. We go in, and just to the left are a set of stairs, which takes us up every part of the hospital. We have to go through and around and back to this main section to go up to the next floor, as the other stairs are locked and have stayed locked for a long time. So I'm doing the usual rounds of the 5 floors. I'm on the 3rd floor and quite bored listening to a podcast when I hear something behind me. Now, to set the scene, I have a flashlight. It's extremely dark because the windows have been partially boarded up, and any external light is only vaguely creeping through. I just about crap a brick. There should be no one in here with me, and obviously there is now, and that's fear-inducing. As I spin my flashlight round, I quickly glance, but there's no one. I turn off my podcast and keep walking around in silence. I stand there for a few minutes, seeing if I can see a light or hear someone, but when I don't, I just call out, "Security, show yourself," but there's still no one. Slightly disheartened, I tell myself that if there is someone in here, they've got no way of escaping, as I didn't lock the door as I came in, so they'd either have to knock and beg to come out, or I'll see them in the next hour. I make my rounds up to the 5th floor, and nothing's happening, but just as I make my way to the 2nd floor, and I'm descending the stairs, do I hear something on the 2nd floor as well, on the doors to the right of me, like a wind that had caused the doors to swing ever so slightly. So I peek through the glass into the gloom of the 2nd floor and see nothing, but it's my job. So I push the doors open, shine my flashlight around, and quickly peek to see if I can see anyone hidden behind some of the beds or chairs or something. But there's nothing. I do a complete sweep of the 2nd floor one more time, as there's no way if there was someone in there that had anywhere else to go, but find no one. I'm really freaking out at this point. All that I do is want to get down to my hut and just ignore the world for another hour. I start making my way back, but before I hit the door, there's a small curtain which I can hide behind, so I decide that I'm going to turn off my flashlight and hide there for a few minutes, just listening to see if there's someone there. I'm not going to lie, the moment I turned my flashlight off and felt the gloom and darkness overcome me, I genuinely felt quite scared, which is something I usually don't feel on my jobs. I waited to see if I could hear any signs of life, and after about 5 minutes of pure boredom and fear, I get up, and just as I'm about to turn my flashlight on, do I hear a giggle from behind the curtain. I instinctively punch the curtain, but it doesn't travel very far, so if there was someone behind it, they didn't get hit. I burst through it and look around the empty room. There's no one here. I do one more thorough sweep, this time believing that Satan and his minions have come to claim my soul, bricking every step, but didn't find a damn thing. I go back to my little hut and didn't work, at least not inspect the inside, for the remainder of the day. The next day, when I was speaking to my relief, I asked them if they'd seen anyone or heard anything unusual in the building, which was the first time I'd ever asked such a question. My relief asks if I'm referring to the ghost, and I casually say that I didn't know what he was talking about. He proceeds to tell me that others have reported seeing and hearing a small child within the hospital walls on different floors, that it's quite playful and excitable, and to not buy into their nonsense. I give him a hearty laugh and tell him that I agree with him, and he's on his way home. I quit shortly after that. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. A huge thank you to everyone who works in the medical profession. I could never do what you do, as I am terrified of all things medical. My grandma was a dentist, you see, and I witnessed some of the things she did, and, well, I found it quite creepy. Not to mention, I don't know, I just don't like hospitals. It's probably because, sick, people are sick there and people get operations and stuff. I don't know, I find it all quite scary. And, I guess some people like, fixing people and knowing what the inside of your body looks like, but that's just something that I don't enjoy. I like horror, but I do not like gore. Like Saw. I really don't enjoy watching Saw. And people get their limbs cut off and stuff. I just don't. I don't like that one bit. So yeah, hospitals make me think of that, and I find it quite scary. Probably the scariest place I can think of is a hospital. Anyway, thank you to everyone for tuning in today. Sorry for no upload yesterday. The night before was a little bit challenging because Pandora didn't get a full night's sleep. I'm not blaming her, she's a child after all, but she didn't sleep very well, and I had a killer headache the whole next day. So yeah, my mind was not ready to read some stories. I'm sorry about that. Anyway guys, I think I'm going to leave this here. Thank you all so much for listening. But I'm going to end it here, so for now, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.